I never thought I'd see anything like it in my life. I grew up listening to the legends of the Appalachian Mountains, stories of people disappearing without a trace, of strange lights glimpsed through the dense canopy of trees, and of screams in the night that sounded like nothing any known animal could make. But honestly, I always figured they were just exaggerations, tall tales cooked up by old folks, maybe a bit too much moonshine around a campfire on a lonely night. You know how it is. We Brazilians, we have our own folklore, our own ghosts and monsters in the jungle. But these American mountains, they felt different, yet familiar in their mystery. A myth is a myth, until it's not. Until that night, when the truth came crashing down, raw and terrifying. And I was right there, a witness to the unraveling. It was September, and the chill was already starting to creep down into the valleys, biting at the skin even through layers of thick wool. I was working as a radio technician for the National Guard, the kind of job that drops you into the most isolated spots, just making sure communication lines stay open between units training in remote areas. It's usually a pretty straightforward gig, a lot of waiting around, fiddling with antennas, shouting into a mic, radio check 1, 2, 3. But this assignment? This was different. Our forward operating post was set up near an old, abandoned mine, a gaping black maw swallowed by the very heart of these mountains. It looked like a wound in the earth, an entrance to something ancient and forgotten. The air around that mine had a peculiar scent, a mix of damp earth, metallic ore, and something else. Something you couldn't quite place, like old breath trapped beneath tons of rock. It made your hair stand on end, even when the sun was high. We received orders to reinforce security in that specific region, because civilians had been reporting suspicious activity. It wasn't just vague complaints, it was specific, unnerving stuff. Hikers vanishing without a trace, leaving only their backpacks or a single shoe behind, as if they'd simply dissolved into the mist. Farmers, good honest folk, waking up to find their cattle in the pastures, not just dead but completely drained of blood, no bullet holes, no knife wounds, just empty. And those sounds, those echoing cries from the forest as night fell, sounds that no one could identify, not even the old hunters who'd lived here their whole lives. They said it wasn't a bear, not a wolf, not even a bobcat. It was something else. At first we laughed it off, of course. We're soldiers, we're supposed to be tough, right? We joked that it must be coyotes on a rampage or maybe some local yokel gone mad, a psycho with a taste for drama. Psychopath of the Appalachians, someone quipped one night, and we all shared a nervous chuckle. But the seriousness in the commanding officer's voice, the way the captain's jaw was always clenched, made it abundantly clear there was far more behind these reports than just local gossip or overactive imaginations. This wasn't a drill, not anymore. The atmosphere in the camp changed from routine boredom to a coiled tension you could almost taste. Helicopters, huge military birds of prey, started patrolling the region almost every night, their thrumming rotors a constant, unsettling heartbeat above us. Drones, silent watchers in the sky, swept the valleys, their invisible eyes scanning every shadow. And armed men, soldiers bristling with weapons, moved through the perimeter, their faces grim, never offering explanations, just going about their duties with an urgent, unspoken purpose. They were like silent guardians, but what were they guarding against? Or perhaps more accurately, what were they guarding for? I just obeyed orders, kept the transmitters humming, tried to ignore the knot of discomfort tightening in my stomach. But the feeling was like a cold hand, slowly, deliberately closing around my gut. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant hoot of an owl, made me jump. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, pregnant with expectation, like the world was holding its breath. The old tales didn't seem so funny anymore. The disappearances, the cattle, the screams. They started to weave themselves into a tapestry of dread, and I was a thread caught right in the middle. Something was definitely wrong. Something ancient and hungry was stirring in these old mountains. The official communiques that usually flowed freely over the radio became increasingly terse, loaded with jargon and veiled warnings. The easy banter between units dried up, replaced by clipped formal exchanges. Even the static seemed to carry a heavier weight. Then, one evening, after a particularly tense briefing, a chilling silence fell over the mountains, deeper than any I had ever experienced. The radios, usually a constant symphony of chatter, went unnervingly quiet. Only the most urgent coded messages broke through, hinting at a heightened alert, a gathering storm. It wasn't just a technical glitch. It was a deliberate, unsettling quiet, a prelude. What kind of storm, I wondered, could silence an entire mountain range? What were they truly preparing for, out here in the middle of nowhere? This wasn't about missing hikers anymore, no. This was about something far bigger, far darker, something that whispered of things best left buried. The quiet was a living thing, and it was watching us. The silence from the previous night was just the beginning, a cold prelude to the relentless escalation that followed. The National Guard presence, which had started as a quiet reinforcement, now swelled into a full-blown military occupation of the valley. It felt less like a training exercise and more like a besieged outpost in a war zone I didn't know we were fighting. Every hour brought new deployments. More Humvees rumbling through the dirt tracks, their heavy tires kicking up clouds of dust that lingered in the still, chilly air. More heavily armored personnel carriers positioning themselves strategically around our makeshift base. It was a suffocating display of force, and it only intensified the unspoken question hanging over us all. What in God's name are we truly up against? Helicopters, those enormous black silhouettes against the bruised twilight sky, were no longer just patrolling. They were sweeping the valleys with an almost obsessive focus, their powerful searchlights cutting through the thick mist and shadows like surgical scalpels. Their relentless thrumming became the new, unsettling rhythm of our existence. You couldn't escape it. It vibrated in your bones, a constant reminder of the unseen threat lurking just beyond the perimeter of our perception. And then came the drones, sleek, silent predators of the air, their invisible sensors meticulously mapping every inch of the rugged terrain. They flew so high you couldn't hear them, but you knew they were there, a silent army of watchers, and the thought was frankly more unnerving than the loud choppers. The soldiers, the men I worked alongside, their faces were etched with a seriousness that went beyond routine duty. They moved with a purpose born of grim resolve, their weapons held tight, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line. No more jokes, no more idle chatter about home or the next leave. Conversations were hushed, clipped, and always about the immediate task at hand, the next patrol, the latest intel that was never truly shared with us, the technicians, but filtered down in fragments of nervous energy and heightened vigilance. They were armed to the teeth, their uniforms heavy with gear, but even with all that firepower, there was a palpable sense of vulnerability in their movements, a subtle tremor of fear that belied their outward stoicism. They looked ready for a fight, but also deeply, profoundly uneasy about what that fight might entail. I, of course, was focused on my job, trying to keep the communication lines clear, the signals strong, the power flowing. It was my anchor in a sea of mounting anxiety, but even my usually reliable equipment seemed to be affected. There were strange distortions in the radio waves, bursts of static that didn't follow any logical pattern, ghostly whispers that would fade in and out of transmissions, making the hairs on my arms stand up. The mountain itself seemed to be pushing back, interfering with our technology, as if it didn't want us to communicate, didn't want us to find out what it was hiding. The captain, a gruff man named Miller, usually all business and straight commands, was now a shadow of his former self. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, and he rarely slept. He'd stand by the large tactical maps, tracing lines with his finger, muttering to himself, his voice so low you could barely catch snippets. Perimeter breaches. Inconsistent signatures. Too fast. What was too fast? What signatures? My stomach churned with a gnawing unease, a feeling that had long since replaced the initial skepticism. The old stories, the legends of the Appalachians, they were no longer just stories. They were becoming real, breathing, living threats. The air in the communication tent, usually filled with the low hum of equipment and the occasional sigh of boredom, now vibrated with an electric tension. Every man there felt it, the invisible coil tightening around us all. The cold embrace of doubt had morphed into a chilling certainty. Something truly significant and dangerous was indeed afoot. This wasn't just a simple security detail anymore. We were on the precipice of something unknown, something primordial. Then it happened. One moment, I was adjusting a frequency, trying to clear up the persistent crackle that was making Captain Miller curse under his breath. The next, a voice frantic and raw with terror, burst through the radio. It was Sergeant Rodriguez, part of a scout team deep in Sector Gamma, near an old logging trail. His words were rushed, distorted, barely coherent. Movement detected. Not natural. Too fast. Meu Deus, it's... And then, a guttural, wet scream that wasn't Rodriguez's, a sound that ripped through the air, followed by a violent burst of static that completely severed the transmission. The comms panel went dead. The entire tent froze. Every man stared at the blinking red light, the silence now screaming louder than any scream. Rodriguez was gone. The forest had claimed him, and whatever he had seen, whatever had taken him, was now out there watching, waiting. The cold embrace of doubt had turned into the suffocating grip of pure, unadulterated dread. The air in the tent hung heavy, thick with the phantom echoes of Sergeant Rodriguez's final terrified scream. The silence that followed was far worse than any noise, a profound, chilling void where his voice had just been. Captain Miller, his face a mask of grim determination, barked orders, sending out search parties, but we all knew in our guts it was futile. The sun set not long after, plunging the Appalachians into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Tonight the sky was utterly without a moon, just a vast inky canvas where stars usually dared to twinkle. Not tonight. Not even the stars seemed brave enough to show their faces. The forest, usually a comforting backdrop of rustling leaves and distant animal calls, now felt like a living, breathing entity. Its shadows stretched and writhed, seemingly reaching out, beckoning, swallowing the feeble light cast by our generators. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of wind sounded like a warning, a prelude. The trees seemed to lean in, their ancient limbs forming gnarled skeletal fingers against the blackness, as if they were closing ranks around us, tightening a noose. I swear you could almost feel its breath, cold and damp against your skin, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something else, something predatory and ancient. The apprehension in the camp was a tangible thing, a shared tremor that ran through every soldier, every technician. Sleep was an impossible luxury. We were on high alert, a phrase that usually sounds like a cliché, but that night, it was a brutal, terrifying reality. Every man was at his post, weapons loaded, eyes strained against the overwhelming darkness. The generators hummed, casting harsh, artificial light within the perimeter, creating stark contrasts with the impenetrable black beyond. It was a desperate attempt to push back the unknown, to carve out a small, fragile bubble of safety in a world suddenly turned hostile. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I monitored the various frequencies, searching for any sign, any whisper, anything that could give us a clue, a hint of what was happening. But there was nothing, only static, a constant, low hiss that sounded like the mountains themselves were sighing. Then, just as the tension had stretched to an unbearable breaking point, a crackle cut through the static, sharp and sudden. It was the main command frequency, open. Captain Miller's voice came through, his tone strained, taut, every syllable laden with a desperate urgency. Movement detected in the mine. Unit Alpha, advance, repeat, advance with caution. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a heavy stone dropping into a still pond. sending ripples of fear through every listener. The mine. Of course. That black maw, that wound in the earth, it was always going to be there, wasn't it? The place where the legends began, where things disappeared, where the unspeakable slept. A chill ran down my spine, colder than the September air. Unit Alpha was our most experienced combat unit, elite soldiers, but even they sounded hesitant, their boots crunching cautiously on the loose shale as they moved towards that gaping darkness. Every breath I took felt shallow, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The silence that followed Captain Miller's order was deafening, a vacuum in which all sound had been swallowed. It was pregnant with anticipation, a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. You could practically hear the collective holding of breath across the entire encampment. We were waiting for something terrible to happen, knowing it was inevitable, but utterly unprepared for its precise nature. Then, it shattered. The silence didn't just break, it exploded. First, it was the unmistakable, terrifying sound of automatic gunfire, short, brutal bursts of rifles, then longer, sustained volleys. The sharp, metallic crack of bullets tearing through the night, echoing off the ancient rocks, a symphony of violence. My hands flew to my ears instinctively, but it was no use. The sound pierced through me, vibrated in my very bones. This wasn't a skirmish. This was a pitched battle, a desperate fight for survival. The sheer volume, the relentless onslaught of lead, spoke volumes of the horror Unit Alpha had encountered. It was raw, unadulterated chaos, unleashed from the dark heart of the mountain. And then, as if the gunshots weren't enough, something else joined the terrifying chorus. Screams. My God, the screams. They weren't human. Not like any human scream I'd ever heard. They were high-pitched, guttural, deep from the chest, almost like laments, wails of something that never was and never should be, sounds that clawed at your soul, tearing at the fabric of reality itself. They cut through the gunfire, silencing even the crackle of the radio, a terrifying declaration that the unthinkable had arrived. The mountains howled back. The screams. Oh, the screams. They reverberated through the night, through the very ground beneath our feet. A sound so utterly alien and profoundly terrifying that it seemed to twist the air itself. It wasn't just noise. It was pure, concentrated horror, tearing at the sanity of anyone who heard it. I'd heard soldiers scream before, in training, from pain or fear, but this was different. This was the sound of something ancient, something that had crawled from the deepest nightmares, finally unleashed. It was a sound of suffering, yes, but also of a primal, unyielding rage that chilled me to the bone. The radio, which had just moments before been a lifeline, exploded into a cacophony of static and garbled voices. I heard fragments, desperate pleas, shouts, then nothing but the rasping white noise that felt like a physical assault on my ears. It was like the mountains themselves had decided to swallow our communications, to isolate us, to ensure we truly felt alone with the terror that was unfolding. The power of it, the sheer force that could cut through our advanced military tech, was a terrifying thought. It meant whatever was out there, it wasn't just a physical threat. It was something almost supernatural, something that defied our understanding of how the world worked. Panic, cold and sharp, began to ripple through our tech tent. We were supposed to be the calm ones, the ones who kept everything running smoothly, but our faces were pale, our eyes wide with disbelief and raw fear. My fellow technicians, usually so methodical and focused, were staring at each other, at the dead comms panel, at the oppressive darkness beyond the tent flap, their training momentarily forgotten. One moment, we were soldiers, technicians, professionals. The next, we were just men, exposed and vulnerable, trapped in a nightmare that was rapidly becoming real. We were paralyzed, caught in that terrible limbo between the instinct to flee, to run as far and as fast as our legs could carry us, and the rigid discipline drilled into us. Wait for orders. But what orders? What could possibly explain what we had just heard? What could rationalize those inhuman cries, the overwhelming, chaotic violence? No military protocol, no training manual, no amount of combat experience could prepare you for this. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the nonsensical, to fit this horror into a framework I understood. Was it some new enemy weapon? Some experimental biological agent? But the screams, they defied all logic, all reason. They were too organic, too filled with a monstrous agony and fury to be anything man-made. It felt like the very earth was groaning, spewing forth its darkest secrets. We huddled together, shoulders almost touching, a silent pact of shared terror. The distant gunfire continued, sporadic now, punctuated by more of those guttural wails. It was a terrifying soundscape, a macabre symphony playing out just beyond our fragile perimeter. Every shadow outside the tent seemed to shift. Every gust of wind felt like a sigh from something unseen. We strained our ears, trying to discern patterns, trying to find some semblance of order in the chaos, but there was none. Only raw, escalating terror. The air grew colder, the pressure heavier. We knew, in the deepest, most primal part of our souls, that whatever had just happened at the mine, it was far from over. It felt like the mountain was waking up, stretching ancient muscles, and we were tiny insects caught in its path. Through the frantic chaos, as the last vestiges of human shouting from the radio died out, replaced by the relentless, chilling static, a new horror unfolded before our very eyes. The floodlights around the perimeter, which had been flickering erratically, suddenly steadied, casting stark beams of light towards the mine entrance. And there, emerging from the dense tree line that bordered the old mine road, a silhouette. It was massive, hulking, dragging something even larger and darker behind it. It moved with an unnerving, deliberate purpose, not with the hurried pace of a fleeing man, nor the clumsy gait of an animal. It was a fluid, almost too graceful movement, utterly unnatural for something of its size. It was too far to make out details, but the sheer scale of the silhouette, the way it moved, the heavy, muffled thud of whatever it was dragging across the earth sent a fresh wave of terror through me. My breath hitched in my throat. It was coming towards us, towards the flickering lights of the outpost, a dark harbinger of whatever monstrous secret had just been unleashed from the heart of the Appalachian darkness. The screams had faded, replaced by this silent, terrifying procession, and the silence was, if possible, even more terrifying. What nightmare was it bringing with it? What monstrous trophy had it claimed from the battle? My blood ran cold. The silhouette grew larger, more defined, steadily approaching our flickering perimeter lights. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. It was like watching a slow-motion nightmare unfold, every second stretching into an eternity. My eyes strained, desperate to pierce the gloom, to understand what monstrous shape was lumbering towards us. Then, as the figure stepped fully into the harsh glare of the floodlights, the world tilted on its axis. My breath caught in my throat, a choked gasp that mingled with the terrified murmurs of the other technicians. It wasn't just one figure. It was several, emerging from the mine entrance like specters from a tomb, dragging forms that were unmistakably human in shape, but grotesquely mangled. But it wasn't the mangled bodies that made my stomach lurch. It was them, the ones doing the dragging. My God, eu nunca pensei que veria algo assim na minha vida. These were the creatures. When the floodlights finally caught their faces, truly illuminated them, the image burned itself into my retina, searing away all pretense of normalcy. Their skin was an unnerving, translucent pale, almost waxy, like old parchment or bone, stretched taut over sharp, angular features. It wasn't merely a lack of sun. It was a fundamental absence of life, a kind of deathly pallor that made them seem alien, otherworldly. But it was their eyes, os alas deals, that truly plunged me into the abyss of horror. They glowed. Not just reflected light, but emitted it with a feverish, hellish red, like embers deep within their skulls, burning with an unholy intensity. They were predatory, yes, but also intelligent. chillingly so. And their mouths, oh, their mouths. When they snarled, which was often, their lips peeled back to reveal impossibly long, gleaming fangs, stained crimson with what could only be fresh blood. They were razor-sharp, glistening, a sickening testament to their hunger, to what they had just done. They were monstrous, undeniably so, yet disturbingly, unsettlingly humanoid. Their bodies were slender, almost gaunt, but rippled with a corded strength that defied their lean frames. They moved with a predatory grace, a fluid, silent efficiency that was terrifying to behold. 3 of them, the ones they were dragging, were still alive, though barely. They thrashed and writhed with an impossible, almost supernatural strength, even wounded, their bodies riddled with bullet holes that seemed to barely slow them down. It was a horrifying sight. Their movements were jerky, desperate, an uncontrollable surge of raw power. They were bound, or at least attempts had been made. Thick, heavy chains were lashed around steel collars that were brutally embedded into their necks. But even with these restraints, it took more than 4 heavily armed soldiers straining and grunting, their faces contorted with effort, to contain each one. 4 men for 1 creature, and they were still struggling, still fighting with a frantic, desperate fury that suggested an unending reservoir of primal energy. The chains themselves groaned under the strain, the metal links whining in protest, threatening to give way at any moment. The soldiers were clearly overwhelmed, their discipline barely holding. Their eyes, wide with terror and exhaustion, darted around, looking for some reassurance, some explanation. But there was none. The sheer impossibility of their strength, the raw, untamed power radiating from these creatures, was a terrifying spectacle. It defied physics, defied biology, defied everything I thought I knew about life and death. A collective gasp went through our tent. "What in God's name are those things?" someone whispered, his voice trembling. No one answered. No one could answer. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't an enemy combatant. This wasn't even an animal. This was something out of the darkest folk tales. A creature of pure nightmare now standing before us. Undeniably real. Undeniable here. The image of those red eyes, those gleaming fangs, the sheer impossible strength, it branded itself onto my memory, a terrifying tattoo on my soul. This wasn't a training exercise. This wasn't even a battle. This was an encounter with the utterly, horrifyingly unknown. We were not ready. And then, as if the sight wasn't enough to shatter every last vestige of my sanity, the overwhelming stench hit me. It wasn't gradual. It was a sudden, sickening wave that assaulted my nostrils, instantly making my stomach churn and my gorge rise. It was a blend of horrors. The metallic, coppery tang of fresh blood, thick and cloying in the night air, mixed with the acrid, burnt smell of something like scorched flesh, maybe gunpowder, maybe something even more disturbing. And underneath it all, a deep, pervasive odor of decay, of corruption, of rot so profound it felt ancient, like the smell of a tomb that had been sealed for centuries and then violently thrown open. It was a smell that spoke of ancient evil and fresh slaughter, of lives brutally taken and of a hunger that knew no bounds. It was the scent of death, but not just any death. It was the scent of their death and our impending one. The world reeled, and for a moment I thought I would be sick. The stench, puta que pariu. It wasn't just a smell. It was a physical entity, a thick, suffocating cloud that clung to the air, to our clothes, to our very skin. It was a sickening blend that assaulted every sense, making the stomach churn and the head spin. Some of the younger soldiers, green behind the ears despite their combat training, openly gagged, their faces turning an unhealthy shade of green under the harsh floodlights. Even the hardened veterans looked visibly disturbed, their noses wrinkled in disgust, their eyes watering from the overwhelming putrefaction. It was the smell of something truly unholy, a profound violation of nature, and it hung heavy, making every breath a struggle. The creatures, still thrashing against their chains, didn't speak in any language I recognized. There were no words, no coherent sounds. Instead, They emitted low, guttural growls deep in their chests, a continuous rumble that vibrated through the ground and into my own bones. It wasn't an animalistic roar of pain or aggression, not quite. It was something more complex, more disturbing. A sound of ancient rage, yes, but also of suffering, of a profound primal lament. It spoke of a capture, an imprisonment, but also of an undying fury, a promise of vengeance. It was a sound that vibrated deep within you, making your own chest ache with an uncanny echo. One of the soldiers beside me, Private Sanchez, a kid no older than my younger brother, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own, suddenly whispered, his voice barely audible above the low growls, "My God, ils sont réels. They are real." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of shattered disbelief. All the legends, all the whispered tales, all the dismissive jokes, they vanished in an instant, replaced by this stark, undeniable truth. The monsters were real. They walked among us, or rather, they had been dragged into our pathetic, fragile reality. It was a terrifying revelation, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world, about what was possible and what was not. Captain Miller, despite the palpable fear radiating from his own tired eyes, somehow managed to regain a semblance of control. His voice, though strained, cut through the growing panic like a razor. He barked orders, sharp and quick, a desperate attempt to contain the chaos, to rein in the unleashed terror. "No filming, nobody films this. Nobody comments on what they've seen. Nobody leaves the perimeter. I repeat, nobody leaves the perimeter." His commands were frantic, bordering on desperation. He knew, just as we did, that this was something that could not, must not be allowed to leak out. This wasn't just a military secret. This was a secret that could break the world. But it was too late. Sha'era tard demise. Some of us, many of us, had already seen too much. The images were seared into our minds, etched permanently behind our eyelids. There was no unseeing this. The creatures continued to struggle, their red eyes darting around, taking us all in. They looked at the soldiers, at the lights, at the weapons with an unnerving intensity. It was then, amidst the captain's desperate orders and the low, constant growl, that one of the creatures, the largest one, momentarily met my gaze. Its head, held firmly by the thick steel collar, turned slowly, deliberately, its burning red eyes locking onto mine across the tense, terrified expanse. And in that brief, horrifying moment, I saw it. Not just animalistic fury, not just blind hunger. No, this was something far deeper, far more terrifying. There was a flicker in those eyes, a profound, ancient intelligence that seemed to pierce right through me, stripping away all my defenses. It was a cold, calculating gaze, utterly contemptuous, as if it saw us for the pathetic, fragile creatures we were, little more than prey. But there was more. There was a challenge, a promise, a deep, simmering hatred for its captivity, for its humiliation. It was the look of a hunter, an apex predator caught and bound, but utterly convinced of its eventual freedom, utterly certain of its revenge. This wasn't just a monster. This was something primordial, something intelligent, something that had been waiting, biding its time, and now it was awake. A shiver unlike anything I had ever felt before ran down my spine, a profound chill that went deeper than my skin, reaching into my very soul. It was a chilling declaration, a silent threat that spoke volumes without a single word, and I knew, with a certainty that froze my blood, that our nightmare had only just begun. The captain's frantic orders hung in the air, but the terror had already taken root. The vision of those intelligent, hateful red eyes burned behind my eyelids, making every breath catch in my throat. We were ordered to prepare the captured creatures for transport. A surreal, horrifying task. It felt like an impossible demand, like asking a lamb to shepherd a wolf. But military discipline, even when stretched to its breaking point, still held us in its cold grip. Armored trucks, built for heavy payloads in combat zones, were brought forward. These weren't your standard transport vehicles. These were hulking beasts of metal, reinforced and designed to withstand explosions. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were using combat-grade vehicles not for warfare against a conventional enemy, but to transport this. To transport ancient horrors pulled from the Appalachian earth. It spoke volumes about the perceived threat. The process of loading them was brutal, a chaotic dance between fear and raw strength. The creatures, even with their injuries and the thick chains, fought with an unnatural ferocity. Each one had to be practically hoisted, half dragged, half carried by a dozen straining soldiers, their muscles screaming with effort. The growls never stopped, a low, constant vibration that seemed to emanate from their very core, a sound of profound displeasure and simmering violence. Their red eyes darted, calculating, assessing, never losing that chilling intelligence. They were not merely struggling, they were observing, learning. It felt like they were cataloging their captors, preparing for a future reckoning. I, along with a few other technicians, was ordered to assist, a surreal and terrifying duty. My hands, usually steady and precise with intricate wiring, trembled as I helped guide the ramp, my gaze constantly flitting back to the thrashing forms. The stench, that abhorrent mix of burnt flesh, iron, and decay, was even more potent now, confined within the smaller space around the trucks. It coated the inside of my mouth, making me gag. Every touch, every near brush with their pale, waxy skin sent jolts of revulsion and fear through me. It was like touching death itself, but death that was unnervingly, dangerously alive. Finally, they were secured, or so we hoped, within reinforced cages bolted to the truck beds. The metal bars were thick, designed to hold wild animals, but these weren't animals. We piled into the trucks, soldiers and technicians alike, a mix of grim determination and barely contained panic. The tension inside the armored truck was unbearable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on us all. The air, already thick with the creature's unsettling presence and that terrible odor, felt heavy, hard to breathe. We sat in silence, our weapons at the ready, our eyes fixed on the cages, on the shadowed forms within. Every jolt of the truck as it lumbered over the rough terrain, every creak of metal, felt like an omen, a premonition of disaster. The journey was fraught with a silent dread. The sheer danger of our cargo was palpable, a live wire humming with destructive potential. We were transporting a bomb, a living, breathing, hate-filled bomb, and we all knew it. We just didn't know when it would detonate. The mountainous roads twisted and turned, narrow paths carved precariously into the steep inclines. The darkness outside was absolute, the only light coming from our headlamps carving out a meager tunnel of visibility in the overwhelming blackness. The forest pressed in on us, a silent, watchful presence, its ancient trees looming like dark sentinels. I kept thinking of the legends, the stories of these mountains being alive, of dark forces dwelling within them. Now those legends weren't just stories, they were warnings. We were driving into that darkness, taking its monstrous offspring away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains wouldn't let them go so easily. It felt like we were driving them to nowhere, to an unknown destination, an unknown fate. But what if the journey itself was the destination? What if we were simply delivering them back to the wild, back to their true home, from which they had only been momentarily disturbed? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. Just as the convoy entered a particularly dense patch of forest, where the tree canopy was so thick it swallowed what little moonlight dared to pierce through, plunging us into an almost absolute blackness, the truck lurched violently. Not a gentle bump, but a sudden bone-jarring heave that threw us against the metal walls. We heard a deafening clang, not the sound of breaking metal from the truck itself, but something far more organic, far more chillingly familiar, followed by an immediate, terrifying snap. It was the sound of something tearing, something giving way, something that shouldn't have been able to break. It was the sound of a chain, and then the screams, human screams. The nightmare wasn't just starting, it had arrived. The sudden violent lurch of the truck had barely subsided when the metallic clang echoed through the cramped, fear-filled space, immediately followed by that terrifying, unmistakable snap. It was impossible. It defied every law of physics, every engineering specification, every ounce of strength we thought we had. The thick industrial-grade steel chain, designed to hold tons of pressure, had snapped like a piece of dry spaghetti, like papal, as if it were nothing more than a toy in the hands of a child. My heart leaped into my throat, choking off any sound. Before the metallic echo even faded, the screams erupted. Not the guttural wails of the creatures this time, but raw, terrified human screams. Our screams. The truck, which had been a temporary fortress, instantly became a steel tomb. The darkness inside, momentarily broken by the feeble red glow of emergency lights, was plunged into a chaotic nightmare. It was the creature we had thought weakest, the one riddled with bullet wounds, that had risen. It was a terrifying testament to their impossible resilience, their unfathomable strength. One moment it was slumped, seemingly inert, its pale skin a canvas of dark bullet holes. The next, it was a blur of motion, a coiled spring unleashed. With a monstrous primal roar that vibrated through the very floor of the truck, it tore through its restraints as if they were made of paper. The heavy steel collar, designed to keep it contained, became a mere decoration, ripping free with a sound that tore at the ears. In seconds, the scene erupted into a horrifying massacre. Foy, a massacre. The creature moved with a speed that was utterly inhuman, a blur of pale skin and razor-sharp fangs. It was too fast, too strong, too brutal. Soldiers, armed to the teeth and trained for combat, were caught completely off guard, their weapons useless against its blinding velocity and terrifying power. There was no time to react, no time to even aim properly. The air filled with shouts, desperate cries, the clang of falling weapons and the wet, sickening sounds of flesh tearing. Blood. Oh God, the blood. Splattered against the reinforced windows, against the interior walls of the truck, illuminated by the frantic strobe-like flashes of gunfire that immediately followed. Some soldiers, recovering their wits, opened fire, their automatic rifles spitting hot lead into the confined space. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of gunfire, screams, and the creature's enraged roars. But the bullets seemed to have little effect, or at least not enough to stop it. They merely angered it further, fueled its savage fury. I could do nothing, absolutely nothing. I was crammed against the back wall, my hands clamped over my ears, trying to block out the horrific symphony, trying to make myself disappear. My body trembled uncontrollably, a pathetic, visceral response to the pure terror unfolding before me. My eyes, squeezed shut, still saw the flashes of red, the horrifying dance of death playing out in the dark. I could smell the metallic tang of blood, thick and overwhelming, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the creature's own repulsive odor. It was a sensory overload of pure nightmare, trapping me in a prison of fear and helplessness. I remember thinking, through the haze of terror, this is it. This is how it ends. We were all going to die here, in this metal box, at the mercy of something ancient and unstoppable. The sounds seemed to last an eternity, though it must have been mere seconds. The gunshots, the screams, the tearing. It was a brutal, efficient slaughter. Then, just as suddenly as it began to quiet. The gunfire became sporadic, then ceased. The screams dwindled to gasps, then silence. The creature's roars faded into a guttural snarl that sounded further away, almost as if it was no longer in the truck. My hands were still over my ears, my eyes still squeezed shut, but a chilling quiet began to descend, far more terrifying than the chaos it replaced. Slowly, hesitantly, I lowered my hands, my eyes still refusing to open fully. I risked a quick, terrified peek. The truck was a carnage. Bodies were slumped, twisted, broken. Blood was everywhere, painting the interior in gruesome strokes. But the creature was gone. It had vanished. And then, through the bullet-riddled exterior of the truck, as my eyes adjusted, I caught a glimpse, just for a fraction of a second, of impossible speed. A blur of white and red, a streak of motion that moved too fast to be real, disappearing into the impenetrable waiting darkness of the Appalachian forest. It was a terrifying confirmation. The nightmare had just been set free. The silence that descended upon the truck, upon the entire forest, was unnerving, absolute. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of death, punctuated only by the ragged gasps of the few survivors and the sickening drip of blood. My hands still trembled, my ears ringing from the concussive force of the gunshots, my mind reeling from the horror I had just witnessed. Slowly, cautiously, I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest, every fiber of my being screaming at me to remain hidden. But the silence, that terrifying quiet, compelled me to see. The scene within the truck was a carnage. Que tragedia. Bodies of soldiers, men I had shared coffee with just hours before, were strewn about, contorted in impossible angles, their uniforms torn, their faces frozen in expressions of ultimate terror. The blood, that terrible metallic scent, was everywhere, coating the interior in a macabre tableau. It was a visceral, brutal reminder of how fragile human life was against the impossible force we had just encountered. My stomach churned, and I fought down the urge to vomit. But the creature, it was gone. The reinforced cage was mangled, its thick steel bars bent outward like twisted wire, a testament to the unimaginable power that had been unleashed. The space where it had been chained was empty, save for the remaining fragments of the heavy-duty chains, snapped clean through as if by an invisible giant. How could something so massive, so dangerous, simply vanish? With trembling legs, I cautiously made my way out of the truck, stepping over fallen equipment and bodies, my eyes wide, scanning the perimeter. The early morning mist was beginning to roll in, thick and heavy, shrouding the forest in an ethereal, ghostly veil. It swirled around the trees, obscuring visibility, making everything feel surreal and dreamlike, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of death, mixed with the damp, earthy smell of the forest and a faint, acrid odor I couldn't place. The first rays of weak dawn light, a pale gray against the inky black of the night, were just beginning to filter through the dense canopy. They cast long, distorted shadows, making every tree trunk seem to twist into a monstrous shape, and as the light slowly grew, revealing more of the ravaged landscape, the full horror of the creature's escape became clear. Deep gouges marred the earth where the truck had been ambushed, long, ragged trenches as if something colossal had scraped its way across the ground with incredible force. Trees along the roadside were shredded, their bark ripped away, leaving raw, splintered wood exposed. Claw marks, impossibly deep and wide, scored the trunks stretching upwards, some reaching branches far too high for any known animal to reach. It was as if something had scaled the forest in a desperate, impossible climb, moving with an unnatural speed, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. There was no blood trail, no heavy footprints leading into the mist. Just these violent, silent marks, a terrifying testament to an entity that had moved through the forest like a phantom, leaving only destruction but no clear path of pursuit. It had simply vanished, disappeared back into the wild, back into the depths of the Appalachian mountains. A profound sense of dread settled over me, colder and heavier than the morning mist. This wasn't just an escaped prisoner. This was something else entirely. Something capable of impossible feats, something that could blend into the very fabric of the wilderness, becoming one with the shadows. The air still vibrated with the lingering presence of the creature, a chilling awareness that it was still out there, watching, waiting, its red eyes burning somewhere in the unseen depths of the forest. The terrifying realization hit me. We hadn't just lost a monster. We had set a predator free. As the first weak light of dawn finally broke through the dense canopy, cutting through the heavy fog with thin, silver shafts, it illuminated something glinting on a nearby tree trunk. It was small, metallic, caught on a splintered piece of wood, almost hidden by a leaf. My breath hitched. It wasn't a piece of the truck nor a fragment of the creature's broken collar. It was an emblem, a small, intricately carved symbol, almost like a crest, made of a dark, aged metal I didn't recognize. It was not part of our military, not part of anything I had ever seen. It was ancient, foreign, unsettlingly out of place, a silent, mysterious artifact left behind in the wake of the terror. It shouldn't have been there. Who did it belong to, and what did it signify? The questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, making the dread in my stomach knot even tighter. The sun finally rose, casting long, stark shadows, but it brought no comfort. Instead, it illuminated the brutal reality of the massacre, the twisted metal, the scattered equipment, and the horrifying silence that had replaced the screams. But the dawn also brought something else, the chillingly efficient cleanup operation. It began with an almost immediate precision, as if an invisible signal had been given to a meticulously orchestrated team. First came the helicopters, not just our standard military choppers, but sleek black machines, some without visible markings, their rotors slicing through the mist with an urgent, purposeful thrum. They swarmed the sky, not searching, but converging, like vultures drawn to a fresh kill. They landed with practiced ease, disgorging their cargo, high-ranking military officers, men with stern faces and ribbons on their chests, their presence radiating authority and an icy calm. And then the others, men in sharp, expensive suits, their demeanor utterly detached, their eyes cold and assessing. They moved with an unsettling efficiency, like a specialized unit designed to erase, to sterilize, to make disappear. They weren't soldiers, they were shadows, agents of a power far beyond our immediate chain of command. No explanations were offered. No one spoke a word that wasn't clipped, formal, and devoid of emotion. They simply took charge, moving through the carnage with an almost surgical detachment. The bodies of our fallen comrades, treated with respect but also with a chilling swiftness, were systematically removed, loaded into specialized containers and flown away, swallowed by the belly of the choppers. There were no flags, no ceremonies, no mournful salutes. Just a grim, silent efficiency. It was as if their very existence was being erased, not just from the scene, but from memory itself. Our equipment, everything that had been touched by the night's horrors, was meticulously collected. My radio equipment, the very antennas I had just huddled behind, were tossed onto pyres. Fuel was doused, and with a guttural roar, fire consumed them, turning metal and plastic into molten slag, sending plumes of acrid black smoke coiling into the Appalachian sky. They weren't just burning evidence. They were burning the very memory of what had happened, incinerating anything that could connect us to the nightmare. It was a terrifying act of erasure, a desperate attempt to wipe the slate clean. The entire site was meticulously sanitized. Every speck of blood, every splinter of wood, every loose stone that might bear a trace of the creatures was gathered, bagged, and removed. It was as if they were scrubbing the very memory of the horror from the face of the earth. We, the surviving technicians and soldiers, were corralled, our weapons confiscated, our communication devices taken. We were treated not as witnesses to a tragedy, but as contaminations that needed to be processed. Then came the papers, hefty, legal documents filled with dense jargon, official-looking seals, and intimidating clauses. We were all forced, under thinly veiled threats, to sign stringent non-disclosure agreements. They called it a failed military exercise, a tragic incident resulting from unforeseen complications during a routine drill. A cover-up, a blatant, insulting lie. But we signed. We had no choice. The men in suits with their unblinking eyes made it clear that dissent was not an option. Our lives, our careers, our very freedom depended on our silence. But we knew. Todos nos sabíamos. Every single one of us who had survived that night, who had witnessed the impossible strength, the red eyes, the unspeakable horror, knew the truth. We knew this wasn't an exercise, This wasn't a drill. This was an encounter with something that defied all explanation, something that had been hidden, and now had to be hidden again, at all costs. The lie was a fragile shield, designed to protect the world from a truth too terrible to comprehend. But it couldn't protect us from what we had seen. As the last remnants of our outpost burned, and the silent, suited agents moved among us, one of them, a tall, gaunt man with eyes like chipped ice, paused. He met my gaze, just for a brief, unsettling moment. There was no warmth, no sympathy, no recognition of shared trauma, only a profound, unsettling certainty in his stare, a chilling awareness that he knew exactly what happened, not just what had happened, but what would happen. He knew. And his look, cold and unwavering, conveyed a silent message. We've been waiting for this. It wasn't a surprise to them. They were prepared. They had just been waiting for the moment to recontain what they already knew existed. And that chilling realization that they had knowledge far beyond our comprehension sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins, leaving me with a profound, unsettling certainty. This was not the first time. Not by a long shot. Days crawled by, heavy with the weight of unspeakable secrets. We were released, dispersed, scattered, ostensibly back to our normal lives, but nothing felt normal anymore. The world around me felt flimsy, a thin veil over a horrifying truth. My mind was a constant loop of the previous night's atrocities, the screams, the red eyes, the snapping chains. Sleep offered no escape. It only plunged me into vivid, nightmarish replays. The non-disclosure agreement, signed under duress, felt less like a legal document and more like a collar tightening around my throat. Then the call came. Not from my direct command, but from an unfamiliar number, a cold, authoritative voice instructing me to report to a federal building downtown, far from the mountains. My heart sank. I knew what it meant. They weren't finished with me. The building was imposing, a monolithic block of gray concrete and steel, devoid of any warmth. Inside it was sterile, hushed, the air conditioning humming with an almost sinister quiet. I was led down a long, unremarkable corridor to a small room, cold, devoid of any personal touches, and most disturbingly, completely without windows. It felt like a bunker, a place where secrets were kept and truths were buried, the perfect setting for a federal lie. Inside, two men in identical dark suits sat across a plain metal table. Their faces were impassive, their eyes sharp, unwavering. They weren't soldiers. They were analysts, interrogators, men who dealt in information and deception. There were no pleasantries, no small talk. They started immediately, their voices calm, measured, but with an underlying steel that brooked no argument. They asked me to recount the events of that night, every detail, my position, what I heard, what I saw. Then they asked again, and again. Same questions repeated verbatim, sometimes with subtle variations, designed to catch inconsistencies, to trip me up, to make me deviate from my story. They watched my facial expressions, my hands, my eyes, searching for any tell, any flicker of doubt or deception. It was a psychological game, a relentless probe designed to break me, to extract every shred of information, and then to ensure my silence. I remembered Captain Miller's frantic orders, the chilling gaze of the suited agent during the cleanup. They didn't want the world to know. That was the paramount objective. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that telling them the full, unvarnished truth about what I had seen, the waxy skin, the glowing red eyes, the fangs, the impossible strength, would not lead to understanding or public disclosure. Would lead to my disappearance, to my silence being enforced by far more permanent means. So I gave them a half-truth, a carefully constructed narrative, devoid of the most terrifying details. I admitted to seeing something strange, something I couldn't identify, something that caused a lot of chaos and resulted in casualties. I spoke of a panicked encounter, of unusual aggression, of a failed military exercise gone horribly wrong. I feigned ignorance about its true nature, pretended that the shock and darkness had obscured the most gruesome specifics. "I saw a blur," I told them, my voice carefully controlled. "A creature, yes, but I couldn't make out details. It was too fast, too dark. Just, chaos. A terrible accident." They listened, their faces unreadable, occasionally scribbling notes on pads of paper. When I finished, they exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance, a silent communication that spoke volumes. Then a faint, satisfied smile played on the lips of the man on the right, a cold, chilling upturn of the corners of his mouth. It was a smile of triumph, of a mission accomplished. It was then that I understood, with a sickening clarity. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for plausible deniability. They wanted a story they could control, a version that wouldn't shatter the public's perception of reality. They didn't want the world to know. And my half-truth, my carefully curated lie, was exactly what they needed. It meant they could label me as traumatized, as unreliable, as someone who saw something but couldn't quite articulate it, making my words easy to dismiss should I ever try to speak out. Walking out of that cold, windowless building, back into the harsh light of the city, under the guise of an ordinary day, I felt an invisible chain tightening around me. It wasn't a physical restraint, but a psychological one, a pervasive sense of being watched, of being controlled. The chilling whisper of those creatures' red eyes, their ancient hatred, their intelligence, echoed in the hollow chambers of my mind. And the satisfied smiles of those federal agents confirmed my deepest fear. This silence, this carefully constructed lie was only temporary. They had buried the truth for now, but the ground was thin, and whatever stirred beneath it would inevitably break free. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, a suffocating blanket that I knew would never truly leave me. They knew, I knew, and the world was utterly, dangerously ignorant. Months have passed since that night in the Appalachians. Meses se passaram. The world outside continues its frantic spin, oblivious, comfortable in its ignorance. Official news reports, the kind that flicker across TV screens and populate online feeds, speak only of wildfires that periodically ravage the remote mountain regions, of unfortunate hikers who went missing and were later attributed to tragic accidents or animal attacks. The authorities even trotted out vague stories of unusually aggressive bear or mountain lion sightings. But I know the truth. Every word is a calculated lie, a carefully crafted narrative designed to keep the masses asleep, to keep the fragile illusion of a safe, predictable world intact. But for me, there is no sleep, no comfort, no normalcy. The memory of those red eyes, burning with a feverish hatred, the image of their waxy pale skin, their impossibly sharp fangs, the terrifying, impossible strength that snapped steel chains like threads of paper. It haunts my every waking moment. It's a constant visceral presence, a cold hand clutched around my heart, a living nightmare that plays on an endless loop behind my eyes. They weren't mere monsters, you see. That's the most terrifying part. They were more, much more. The way they moved, the calculating intelligence in their gaze, the ancient predatory cunning that shone through their animalistic fury. They looked at us not just as simple prey, but as something to be despised, something to be revenged upon. They were captured hunters, old and powerful, momentarily subdued, humiliated by human technology and arrogance. And in their eyes, I saw not despair, but a chilling patience, a quiet certainty that they were merely waiting for the opportune moment to strike back, a moment when our guard was down, when our vigilance wavered. They were not defeated. Oh no. The National Guard didn't defeat them. We merely poked them. We disturbed their ancient slumber, stirred a hornet's nest of unimaginable evil, and then foolishly believed we could contain it. Today the mountains are quiet, officially, but I feel it, deep in the pit of my stomach, a persistent tremor, a cold shiver that has nothing to do with the weather. I feel their presence lurking in the shadows, hidden in the deepest forgotten caverns beneath those ancient peaks. They are still there, waiting, healing, planning. The official news with its bland reports is just a lullaby, a desperate attempt to drown out the growing rumble beneath the earth, the slow, deliberate pulse of something truly terrifying preparing to emerge. And when they return, because I feel it, in the deepest part of my chest, in the very core of my being that they will return, no one will be prepared. Not the National Guard, not the high-ranking officials, not the suited agents with their cold eyes. They've managed to sweep this one incident under the rug, to convince the world it was just a bad dream. But you can't contain something so ancient, so powerful, so filled with a primordial hunger, with lies and cover-ups. It's like trying to hold back the ocean with a sieve. I was there. You, Stevie La, I saw it all with my own eyes. The vampires of the Appalachian Mountains are real. They are not just legends or fairy tales. They are flesh and blood, bone and fang, ancient intelligence and insatiable hunger. And the truth, the terrifying, world-shattering truth, is being hidden from all of us. But for how long? How long before the darkness rises again, before the silence is broken by a chorus of screams that no military lie can ever hope to explain away? The world sleeps unaware, while ancient predators stir in the darkness of the mountains, biding their time. And I, a solitary keeper of this horrific secret, am left with the profound, unsettling certainty that the real nightmare has only just begun. The question isn't if they'll come back, but when. And what then? What then when they finally walk among us again, openly, undeniably? May God help us all. If you felt that chill, that creeping dread, then you know this story runs deeper than words on a screen. Don't let the truth stay hidden. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments. From what city or country are you watching this? Share your thoughts, your own eerie tales, and together, maybe we can keep the light on just a little longer.